admirable sorcery, conveyor of the invisible, an invasion of privacy, a domestic tragedy. All of these phrases to describe the telephone? (1877), you enter Dunrad's restaurant in the Atlanta passenger rail station. And you see a sturdy wood box with a metal circle. You grab the box and put it up to your mouth and yell into the metal circle, as it's the only way the person at the other end can tell that you are trying to reach them. Once you get their attention in this fashion, you put the box to your ear. The line runs to the freight depot and was installed by Alexander Graham Bell and his investors. One of several that in 1877 would be installed around the nation and around the world. Hard to imagine a technology that leaped as fast as the telephone. Invented in 1875 when Bell told his assistant Watson in another room, "Come here, Watson." And he did, though he could not hear him with a normal voice. Just 2 years later, you had local lines. Within 5 years, there were 1,500 phones in a New York exchange. There were exchanges, switchboards in major cities. The yelling was now replaced by a bell to signal the call. Within 10 years of the invention, concerts would be broadcast over the phone in Europe and sermons in America for eager listeners, with wood square boxes and little butter stamp one-piece phones. The butter stamp would be for talking and listening, and it looked like that household instrument that you'd use to smash butter. 15 years from "Come Here, Watson," businesses would start advertising their phone numbers. Competition between phone services would begin in America. A line would connect Moscow to St. Petersburg, Paris to Brussels. The House of Commons would be connected to the London Times. Bismarck had a line installed between his government office and his faraway farm, while Franz Joseph of Austria refused to allow the new device, which portended to equalize who could talk to whom. No wires in the Habsburg Palace, thank you. While in Chicago, as an observer noted, there was already a very busy phone exchange. Boys are rushing hither and thither in the exchange office, while others are putting out pegs from a central framework as if they were lunatics engaged in a game of fox and geese. Part of the reason the telephone spread so fast is that it initially ran through lines that were already in the ground and above the ground, the telegraph lines. The circuits could handle extra capacity, so a network, a crude one at times, had already been in place since that invention, the telegraph in 1844. But it spread from these commercial telegraph circuits to private homes. America, said one British observer, Arnold Bennett, was threaded under pavement and all over roofs and between floors and ceilings by millions and millions of live filaments that unite all the privacies of the organism and make them one immense publicity. Yes, and by 1890 you already had some concerns that the telephone was ruining the domestic household by introducing going-ons from without. By 1890, there were 2 phone companies competing for the phone business, and long-distance calls from Atlanta to Chicago could be made, not all over the nation and not coast to coast yet. In 1891, a line was run between the U.S. and Great Britain. The future president and tragic victim James Garfield would be the first president, we could say, to use a phone. There was an exhibition version installed in his house before he became president, right before. Cleveland and Harrison had the devices in the White House, mostly used, though, by servants. In 1896, phone users would hold the butter stamp and other receivers to their ear, awaiting the election returns and the announcement that William McKinley had defeated William Jennings Bryan for the presidency. Back in Atlanta, by 1884, the city had 370 telephone subscribers served by the new Atlanta Phone Exchange on the top floor of a building. The top floor made it easier for the wires to reach the telephone poles. The teenage operators had to remember the names, back in 1884, the names of all the telephone subscribers. But as that became impossible in just a few years, numbers were assigned to them. So in 1890, you called Loftus Plumbing in Atlanta and would call the main bell switchboard and ask for 1184, please. Operators learned some tricks. They had to be fast. They had to have nimble fingers. They had to be polite. Sometimes the customers weren't. Yes, there were already articles in newspapers about how people were acting differently on the telephone than they ever would in homes, since they didn't see the person. When they were told, look straight forward and speak up, looking around the room would cause you to lose attention, and there goes the voice. Because of the poor reception, telephone operators learned to exaggerate words they were saying. Number, please. Number, please. So that they could be heard on the other end of the phone. 9 became 9. An interesting thing started to happen, and something that I'm not sure most are aware of, that the telephone became a kind of early radio. You could get news from your telephone. We talked about how William McKinley and so many other Americans could learn about his election through the phone. He also learned about his nomination and listened to the Republican Party convention in 1896 over a live telephone. You could even get religion over the phone. Here's a note from, this is in 1910, the Chicago Tribune. There were events like this going on before it. Recently, the writer sat in an easy chair in a hotel 3 blocks away from the church, and with an ordinary telephone receiver to his ear, heard every word of the service in the church, the reading of the scripture, the prayer, the singing of the psalms, the announcements, the sermon, and the benediction. Sometimes the receiver had to be held away from the ear on account of the loudness with which the sermon was transmitted. The manager of the telephone company says that a constantly growing number of the company's patrons use this service on Sundays, and this raises the consideration as to what will be the effect on the churches should the electrophone come into general use. Will the preacher of the future sit in his study and preach his sermon before an electrophone, while his congregation sat at home in easy chairs with telephone receivers to their ears? Or will we have canned religion as we have canned music sent out from a central station every Sunday morning and evening? Will there be different grades of service so that those who can afford the high-priced brand may have it and hear the great pulpit orators of the world, the pealing of the great pipe organs in the metropolitan churches, and the wonderful singing of high-priced and famous choirs? The objection that all this neglects the personal equation will vanish. The average person didn't have a phone for themselves. That would be for the ultra-rich. For most Americans, they used a party line, which meant that many people shared the same line. And if they had a receiver attached to that line, they could listen in. In fact, they could listen in to all the conversations. And very often, they did. One learned not to say anything private on a phone. And when there were emergencies where the police or the medical authorities needed to be summoned, everybody in the community learned about it quickly. For a time, you had to pick up every ring on that party line to find out if it was a party for you. Later, a system was developed to ring differently for each house. You might be 2 long rings and a short, or 3 short rings and a long. So you and your family knew it, and you knew when to pick up. It didn't mean that others weren't listening to, and there's a famous story, a rural telephone that talked about a short story that talked about how a rural community kept in touch with each other through the use of a party line phone. This history of the telephone is interesting for a couple of reasons. One is that it really was a fast technological development. Look at how long it took the internet, for instance, to develop from where it was in the 1960s and 70s to the 90s and where we are today. But for the telephone, it was a quick rise. Reach out and touch someone, right? If I'm doing my job here, you may not even be aware that this is an older podcast of My History Can Beat Up Your Politics, actually from 2013. But of all of them that I have recorded, this cast called I Was Born in 1869 is my personal favorite. So please enjoy it as we round out the summer here. A lot of good stuff planned for the fall, so keep listening. If you're not subscribed to the show on iTunes, do it. Google Podcast app, CastBox, wherever you listen to podcasts. Give us reviews. We could use them. Spread the word. And remember about the premium podcast from myhistorycanbeatupyourpolitics.com. When you subscribe to the My History Can Beat Up Your Politics premium, you're actually going to get an archive, because the premium has been going on now since 2016, so it has its own archive. And then you're going to get minimum 25 episodes of archive shows, but you'll also, depending on your membership, you'll get more. The minimum membership is $2 a month. You know, people had asked me previously, hey, Bruce, you used to do the archive and sell everything for $25. Well, you know, at that friends level, it's just $2 a month. So go and sign up, support the program. You know, we've had a lot of people sign up, and I really appreciate your support. We have people at all members levels, including the Chester Arthur and even the Cincinnati, and that very grateful for that support. It helps to keep this project going. You know, and certainly I only ask for donations or subscriptions to the premium podcast if you're in a position to do so. Don't put yourself in any financial strain helping me out. I mean, I'm okay. It's just that, you know, this is some work, and, you know, go there, www.myhistorycanbeatupyourpoliticspremium.com. One episode that is, I was listening to again earlier that's on this premium podcast is 10 Things to Know about George McGovern and his selection of VP candidate Thomas Eagleton that you may not be aware of. Another one I just did is we have the leftovers from the legal pads. And I talk about Reed Smoot and his diary and his life that we weren't able to get to on the cast. And I talk a little bit more about my conversation with Leon Neyfakh and what I would have liked to ask him if we had more time. Just a great way to support the podcast, but also get more content from me and get a little meta content about how the cast is created and things like that. Thanks for your support. But it's also a shocking new technology, that a voice could be transmitted over wires, that people could be put in places that they didn't exist in. Shocking. And it really did change the world. And I think it's so interesting as we're reaching a point where the technology might have reached its end. Now, what do you mean its end, Carlson? What are you talking about? Well, the voice side of the telephone is getting less and less used, right? Of course. Those of us in the older generation use it still. People still make calls. But now, one sees everyone with telephones and very few using it for voice anymore. Text has become the way. But there's another reason to discuss the telephone besides these interesting points. On the fans of My History Can Beat Up Your Politics website, our Facebook site where you can go, and there's a link to it at www.myhistorycanbeatupyourpolitics, W.V. Sterling asked, I was born in 1969. I wonder what it was like to be born in 1869. He says more, and we'll get into it. But let's just take that for a second. I think that's the post-Civil War generation, born in 1869. Their fathers, in many cases, fought on one side or another. By the time they were 20, the frontier that they had learned about in books, drawings, etc., the Wild West, the frontier was declared by the U.S. Census to be closed. And in their 20s and 30s, the 1890s and the 1910s, the nation was seeking other territories and going to war with a European colonial power. But for 1869, those born in that year, telephone was probably one of the most significant developments that they saw in their lifetime. Were very young when the device was invented, and they saw the development and the deployment of the telephone. It was not strange at all for them to be able to hear a voice from far. That was the big development of their time. And it wasn't just a small thing. It affected business and government, how fast transactions could occur, or how far the government could reach. It connected people. It made moving away from the home a little easier, a little bit. Railroads were another development for these 1869ers and thereabouts. Railroads invented 40 years before their birth would reach a new level of complexity and coverage in their time. 22,000 passenger locomotives and 17,000 freight locomotives tied together the nation into a network during their time, allowing companies to compete nationally, allowing these 1869ers to receive goods that they were nowhere near the factories for. The spread of the telephone was helped by the spread of the railroad through the catalog. Sears and Montgomery Ward, the two big catalogs at the time, were selling telephone sets. Other technological marvels existed. The bicycle would get cheaper and plentiful. We don't think of the bicycle as a big development, right? Just a common thing. But for the 1869ers, that's when it happened. It had been a fairly expensive and difficult device just for the rich. And now when you're getting into the 1880s and 1890s, when they're coming of age, they're riding around in bicycles. And so those who were of a lower income level could travel around farther than they could by their feet. Cameras became portable, the Kodaks. So much so, by the time they were 20, they could read in the New York Times how public figures were being stalked by journalistic photographers called Kodakers trying to snap. In their later years, the Nickelodeon, 10,000 of them in America, would exist by the time they were 40. The motion picture and the automobile would be late arrivals in technology for them, but would be something they would be exposed to nonetheless. In their far later years, when many of these 1869ers became successful, the airplane would make its appearance. Futuristic novels, Jules Verne, H.G. Wells, would predict fantastic changes about what would come in their lifetime. Flying machines, telephone newspapers, news given through voice instead of paper. Wells, for instance, predicted paved roads with advertisements on the side. A London that would reach into Wales, and a giant megacity from Washington and Albany, with everyone in the 20th century to come to be connected by explosive engines. He wasn't too far off. Who were they? Americans born in 1869 or thereabouts, anywhere from 1868 to 1872, say. Cal Coolidge, Harry Houdini, Stephen Crane, John Nance Garner, the politician, former VP, Warren Harding, Henry Firestone, Orville Wright, the author Zane Grey, the former Attorney General Mitchell Palmer. They're children of Civil War era parents. It's possible that their fathers fought. I'd say they were a kind of tech generation, at least the 19th century one. The war was over, and the nation had just completed the Transnational Railroad and was looking at a bright future. W.V. Sterling's question continues on the Fans of My History Can Beat Up Your Politics Facebook site. I wonder if the 69ers weren't more influenced by what their parents told them about and what conventional wisdom said about the 10 to 20 years leading up to their coming of age. Reconstruction, Civil War vets, the Grant administration, the Johnson impeachment, Jay Custer and the westward expansion. Current events are always debated, W.V. Sterling writes, but the recent past is what everyone knows. It's a fascinating point. Thank you, W.V. Fascinating point to think about. So, when we're trying to consider a time period, perhaps the motivation of various actors, we need to go back and think about what generation their parents were in, what recent past they experienced through stories. What were they thinking and how did they view things? If you were born, say, in 1969, and I'll admit, I'm around your age, WV. I was born in 1971, sent here, as I like to say, to replace Jim Morrison on this earth. If you were born in 1969, you were getting a view of what happened before from your parents, from your teachers, from movies, books, and from TV, miniseries, documentaries, first on PBS, then on VHS perhaps, and eventually on the History Channel. You grew up with cable arriving, and the personal computer was, for you and I, the big technology, something that you fell right into using. Now, the internet came later, and if you're like me, you're just as excited and took it on with just as much gusto, but it did come later. You were already using a computer with big keys, and I remember being told not to type the keys so hard you're going to break the computer because I had used electronic typewriters before that. Your key events are the Cold War, the Russians, not the duck and cover generation of the Russians, not having Stalin on the other side, but having Brezhnev and the others on the other side. A constant and now forgotten reminder that the United States had a Soviet missile pointed at it in almost every city. We remember the movie War Games in the 1980. Pointing this out with a little line showing the missiles coming from Russia to every significant American city. If either the president or the Kremlin decided, the world could be blown to bits. That was our time. Looking backwards, you were born in the year of Woodstock, so obviously you can't have found out about it personally. You were also born in a time that any American, regardless of race, could vote in any state. So you are hearing about the civil rights struggle through parents, perhaps, or historical sources. Hearing about events. So, and here I'm speculating a bit. When I say you, I'm talking about anyone born in this time, 1968, say, to the early 70s. When you live through events, they are one thing. When you hear about them, they are another. And I suggest that they assume an almost mythic importance, I suspect. Civil rights, the 60s, and the anti-war movement, almost mythic importance for people that really were coming of the age in the 70s, 80s, 90s. They're hearing about these great struggles. They were big times for the people that lived through them, but perhaps they're even bigger for those that heard about them. I'll relate a personal example. It's almost meaningless, but I'll relate it. I can always remember growing up and thinking, Woodstock, wow, that must have been a big event, what a concert. And I do remember talking to an individual who was in high school at the time saying, yeah, we tried to get up there. It was a big concert, but, the highway was blocked out and we couldn't. So, like, my mythic event was like his bad Saturday. I know, tells you a little. So maybe we can read into this a little bit, this speculative, of course, about what 1869ers might have been thinking about the Civil War, Reconstruction, etc. I think it is the view of their parents and other elders, maybe a little bit also with their own views interjected. And that means those 1869ers are as divided as the country was. Many different viewpoints about what the Civil War and Reconstruction meant. But there's two men that I'd like to look at, and these men are too young to be parents of 69ers. Woodrow Wilson, born in 1853, and Theodore Roosevelt, born in 1858. Just boys during the Civil War, had different experiences, different views of America. Wilson was the son of a Southern Episcopal preacher and witnessed the horror of defeat. Roosevelt, from his writings, seems to have more of the idea about the Civil War of a victorious side. That in one case he writes that men could have avoided war, but once war came, they showed their manly vigor, and thank God for it. Wilson sought peace during the Great War in Europe, keeping America out as much as we could, tried to stay neutral, even negotiate at one point between Germany and Britain, offering himself the role of doing that. Wilson was very reluctant to send American troops into that war, eventually did. The entire time, Theodore Roosevelt and other Republicans were pressuring to jump in. Roosevelt, we know, famously started the Rough Rider unit during the Spanish-American War of 1898. This 1898 event would have been a key event for people born in the 1850s like Roosevelt, but also for the 1869ers, where America really enters the international stage. Roosevelt started the Rough Riders, and they fought in the Battle of San Juan Hill. These Rough Riders are an interesting group to look at. He recruited them from various parts of the country. He recruited many soldiers from the Southwest where they might be used to the climate. But he also recruited officers from Harvard. And among the people he recruited were well-known athletes at the time. Colleges were where sports was at the time. Quarterbacks, tennis champs, pole vaulters, marathon runners. A lot of folks in the Rough Riders were born in 1869 or thereabout. There's Dean Dudley, the quarterback at Harvard, who was in this regiment. Hamilton Fish Jr., the grandson of the Secretary of State under Grant, who charged up the hill into bloody Spanish fire and was killed. Robert Wren, Harvard tennis player, joined the regiment. Craig Wadsworth of Yale, who later Theodore Roosevelt gave a position to London during his presidency and sent him a stern letter telling him he believed in him because he had been in his regiment during the war, but he expected Wadsworth, to honor his grandfather's service in the Civil War. You can see what Roosevelt's attitude was, and the eagerness of Harvard recruits. Roosevelt writes that he had more recruits for the Rough Riders from Harvard and Yale than he could possibly take. The eagerness for them to enter an international battle says something about their views of war and their view of where America's position in the future should be. But they didn't reflect all Americans born in that time or all Americans at all. America was largely isolationist, have recently felt the horror of a civil war, and were not looking to join new fights. The author Stephen Crane was born in 1971, right about this time. His strict Methodist father died in 1880. He was raised by a devout Methodist mother who moved him to a Methodist community. He became a writer, writing in the style of new realism that existed around the time that he would come of age, the 1880s, 1890s. One of the stories, The Red Badge of Courage, is his most famous work. It was saluted by some veterans at the time by how much it brought them to the realism of battle. Some people wrote him and said, "What regiment were you in?" But Crane had never served. He was born after the Civil War had ended. His novel glorifies the fight. Henry Fleming, the protagonist in the story, is stunned by combat the first time it happens. Prior to a battle, he had talked to a friend of his about his fear, and his friend said, "We still must go in and fight." Henry Fleming goes to the first battle and is so cowed by fear that he flees, thinking that his regiment's being overrun. His regiment was not. He runs, then he decides to go back to the regiment. Fortunately for him, he's accidentally injured on the way of running back, with a group of retreating troops coming at him and accidentally hit with a rifle butt. So when he arrives back at the regiment, his regiment thinks he was injured in battle. So, in a way, he fooled them. He sees his childhood friend who he'd spoke to before the battle. He is wounded. He had his red badge of courage. So Henry Fleming's story is his quest to get his red badge, to get the glory of war. Many praised this work. The New York Times called it a true book. For Ambrose Bierce, a real Civil War veteran born in 1842, there's no fooling around with honor and war. A lieutenant in an Indiana Union brigade, he saw the war. It was no heroic fight. In his occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, a man is hanged for arranging to demolish a bridge to thwart the Yankee army. The man escapes when the noose falls into the water. He swims out. He runs under Yankee bullets. He runs through the woods and goes home to see his dear wife. And then, whack, he fears a sharp jolt in his neck. Bierce now lets us know that it is now that he is hung. He has never escaped. That was all just us witnessing his own brain in action, dreaming. He never escaped. Chickamauga is a story that's even more sinister. We follow the point of view of a young boy in the woods playing around. Now he's scared when he sees a big rabbit. But then when he sees a group of uniformed men crawling through the woods, well, the boy thinks this is safe, it's natural. He wants to play with them. He is, as the Bierce unhelpful narrator tells us, reminded of the painted clowns with whom he had last seen in summer in the circus. He does not recognize them as soldiers who are, in reality, wounded and in agony, thus crawling up, and the paint that he sees is blood. He thinks it is like his servants growing up. He's playing around with them, pretending to ride on a horse. He laughs at them, while the maimed and dying men, not knowing any better, are walking through the woods. When the boy leaves the woods and goes home, his house is on fire, his mother dead. The translation for Bierce, war is hell. And it's not for amateurs to be writing about. He hates Crane's book about the red badge. And when a reviewer pans it, he thanks the reviewer for exposing the Crane freak. In those two writers, we see a different view of two generations of the Civil War. For William Allen White, an important progressive born around this time, his upbringing by Republican New Englander parents influenced his views. His mother came to Kansas with the expressed intention of teaching black children after the Reconstruction. He grows up and he desires to rid his state, Kansas, of the Ku Klux. He's also a progressive leader. Kansas, of all states, should be free of this taint of bigotry and terror, and not have a government beholden to this hooded gang of masked fanatics. He ran for governor on an anti-Klan ticket. He lost, but he became a progressive editor, an important part of the Republican progressive movement. For W.E.B. Du Bois, a significant black writer and activist of the teens and 20s, his father had been a Union soldier. His mother believed in hard work, discipline. Discrimination was untrue. Just work harder and you won't be discriminated. It instilled in him a desire to test himself and not to be vain. Du Bois would become an outspoken critic of American society, white society. He chafed at the misinterpretation of history during his lifetime, how the work of African Americans during the Civil War was forgotten. The veritable strike that occurred by slaves fleeing to the Northern Army, 200,000 of them. That, he said, is what led to the South's demise, even more than the Yankee Army. But that never showed up in the tellings of history from the 1890s to the 1940s. Du Bois was born in 1869, and he noted that the Civil War, oddly in history, was becoming merely a fight to preserve the supremacy of the white race. He cried how Northern industry had bought up the South, and then was just as responsible for keeping black citizens in low-wage jobs. He decried the combinations and the profits that were made when he was 30 and 40 between 1890 and 1900. And if you're looking for the period when this generation would reach their influence, I see the 1920s as the time. And it is in the 1920s when we might witness an odd couple meeting in an office in the deep bowels of the Capitol building. Bourbon was served, cards were dealt, cigars smoked, and conversation exchanged. Yes, it's during Prohibition, but don't be fooled. That didn't apply to the U.S. Capitol. It was the Bureau of Education, and two opposite sides would meet: John Nance Garner and Nicholas Longworth, the Speaker of the House, head of the Republican Party, now strictly conservative. Garner was from Texas. He had relatives on the Confederate side. He grew up with a traditional view of the war that caused him to see bankers as responsible, Yankee finance as responsible for oppressing the South and leading to the conflict. He hated banks, defended farmers. He ran as a populist in Texas, became a judge, and then a state senator. When in 1902 he got to Congress, he continued his anti-bank rants and his populist feeling. He was a key critic of Andrew Mellon, the Treasury Secretary in the 1920s. Nicholas Longworth was very different. He came from one of the wealthiest and oldest Cincinnati families. He was a Republican, but no progressive. He believed the job of government was to preserve the best environment for business. He and his family saw the Civil War not as a launch pad for radical change in our time, but something that simply had to be done. And despite being married to Alice Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt's daughter, he supported Taft and not Roosevelt in 1912. He was no party bolter, and he was a conservative. These were two different people, but they got along fine. As Garner said, I was the heathen, and Nick was the aristocrat. But Garner, for all his populism, was fairly conservative too. He would go on to replace Longworth as Speaker after Longworth's death propelled the Democrats into the majority. His speakership was fairly conservative, though he did belatedly, in a bid to run for president, support a public works bill. He ran for vice president with Franklin Roosevelt, but steadily opposed his New Deal, and he would leave the ticket in 1940. The 1869ers, with their telephones and railroads and beginnings of international involvement for the United States, a generation that was aware of America as a future place, not the largest, not the strongest, but one of the fastest growing nations. An interesting generation. And a look at how different and diverse a group of people in America born in one year can be, then as now. And I hope you enjoyed it. The website is www.myhistorycanbeatupyourpolitics. If you do like the program, please tell someone about it. Thanks for listening.